Hello, POL347. I hope everyone is doing well. I miss seeing you all, but I trust you're keeping safe and sound. So continuing on from the discussion we had before the interruption about the politics leading into NAFTA, the terms of NAFTA, some of the criticisms of NAFTA, we're going to be taking a closer look at the recently formalized successor agreement to NAFTA, USMCA. So we'll talk about the process of initiating USMCA negotiations, seeing those through, and ultimately leading to the final agreement. We'll look at parallels between NAFTA and USMCA, and also a number of ways that USMCA attempts to address some of the perceived shortcomings of NAFTA and improve upon them. So we'll get started with kind of a general gist of where USMCA stands. So as y'all can imagine, as with a lot of the major political projects on the agenda in all three countries, really everywhere globally, but particularly in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, USMCA is in flux. A lot of things right now are on pause. But USMCA was, at least in Canada and the United States, it was the last serious legislative item to be dealt with prior to this hiatus and prior to this kind of emergency period the entire world is dealing with right now and dealing with the coronavirus. So we're talking about a very recent development and still a very fluid situation, not surrounding the deal in and of itself, which is a done deal, but its implementation and the timeline for the transition from NAFTA as it stands to USMCA. So the first round of the agreement, first draft of the agreement, was signed by all three parties, all three leaders of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, respectively, on November the 30th of 2018. But this was around the time that the Democrats were taking control of the House of Representatives in the United States. So with that kind of leverage, the Democrats really pushed President Trump on a number of provisions relating to labor protections and the environment in particular. So that led to almost exactly a year later an amended agreement being agreed upon by all three countries. So this was on December the 10th, 2019. That was what ultimately would become the final draft of USMCA. So it's since received enabling legislation passed in the House of Representatives here in the United States and the Senate here in the United States in overwhelming margins in both places. So I believe was a margin of 89-10 in the Senate, and all but 41 members of the House of Representatives voted in favor of USMCA. So unlike NAFTA, USMCA has a very impressive and overwhelming level of bipartisan support here in the United States. So the most recent piece of enabling USMCA legislation was actually passed in Canada on March the 13th, on Friday, March the 13th. So this was the very last item Canada considered before going on an indefinite hiatus due to the coronavirus outbreak in terms of its parliament and sittings in its parliament. So this was the very last piece of legislation that was considered in Canada. It was passed unanimously in Canada's parliament. It's also been passed in Congress in Mexico. So it's a done deal now, but there's still some uncertainty as to when it's going to come in effect. Again, given the global environment surrounding coronavirus and the uncertainty that's been created by this pandemic, but a start date that has been proposed by the United States Trade Representative is that of June the 1st, 2019. So that's a timeline that's being worked towards. It's unclear as to whether or not we're going to be able to make the timeline given everything that's going on in the world right now. So we'll get into the text of the agreement as this lecture progresses, but it contains 34 chapters, which is 12 more than NAFTA, despite the fact that it retains most of the substance of NAFTA, as well as 12 different side letters. So on issues like the environment and labor and intellectual property and security of data and sort of technological issues were a really big thrust of USMCA as well. So we'll get into hopefully some of the more important of those provisions as this lecture progresses. So just to give you a brief timeline, so Donald Trump, over the course of his 2016 presidential campaign, really hammered on NAFTA, calling it at various points in the campaign the quote-unquote worst trade deal ever. As we all know by now, he quite surprisingly won the election in 2016, in November of 2016, defying the expectations and the predictions of virtually all of the political pundits and the political experts. If you look at the anatomy of that victory, the states that really carried it for Trump and really pushed Trump over the top were the former Rust Belt states. So Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in particular were quite central to Trump's path to getting over the threshold in electoral college votes. These three states are perceived as being among the biggest losers of NAFTA, as the centers of the former steel and auto and consumer electronics manufacturing hubs in the United States. These are three of the states that have been are perceived to have paid a disproportionate price for a lot of the changes in the American economy that have taken place under NAFTA. So it's not entirely surprising that electorates in each of these states would have responded so positively to President Trump's anti-NAFTA rhetoric. And sure enough, just a few months into his term as president, President Trump informs Congress of his intention to renegotiate NAFTA with his counterparts in Canada and Mexico. So this triggers what's called Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA, which was formerly Fast Track Authority. This is basically an enabling power that has been created and facilitated by various pieces of trade-related legislation that gives the president and the United States trade representatives in particular unilateral power to negotiate and sign free trade agreements. So per the terms of TPA, Congress, the House and the Senate, is allowed to either approve or reject trade deals that are concluded by the president, but cannot alter their language. So Congress gets a simple yes or no vote. It cannot propose any kind of modification or any kind of amendment. That entire authority to determine the terms, determine the language of a trade agreement, that rests with the president, and more specifically with the president's trade representative. So the individual in question right now, who plays that role, who has the ball in his court, is the current United States Trade Representative Robert E. Lighthizer. So the United States Trade Representative is a cabinet-level office based in the executive office of the President of the United States, and it also carries the title of ambassador. So the United States Trade Representative, on the basis of being an ambassador, can get into formal negotiations with other sort of foreign diplomats and other foreign designates. So on this basis, it's ultimately the United States Trade Representative who serves as the chief negotiator in bilateral and multilateral trade talks. And on this basis, he speaks up on behalf of you and me, speaks on behalf of the United States government and the people of the United States. So the current United States Trade Representative Robert E. Lighthizer, he's a Trump appointee. He's been known in various circles for his qualified support of protectionism and anti-free trade policies. So he was one of the more hawkish choices that President Trump could go with among qualified individuals. So keep that in mind as we get into the text of USMCA. So continuing with the timeline, so after President Trump serves notice to Congress, negotiations with Mexico and Canada begin in earnest a few months later. At this point, there's very little progress for around the first year or so. of these negotiations. They passed through 8 rounds with a number of disagreements and a number of sticking points in areas like auto sector rules of origin, also Canadian dairy quotas, and the various dispute resolution mechanisms and panels that we've gotten into a little bit in lecture. But what really tips the balance here is the election of AMLO, of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico on July the 1st, 2018. So AMLO is known for kind of a very radical left type of populism. There was a lot of concern over how having AMLO as president of Mexico would complicate these negotiations even further. So this put a lot of pressure on all 3 parties to get a deal done before AMLO's inauguration. So Mexico is a little bit unique. There's a 5-month period between the election at the beginning of July and the inauguration at the beginning of December, which gave negotiators more of a window than would have been the case if there was a new head of government in either Canada or the United States. But nevertheless, they needed quite literally every single hour of that window to get a deal done that was acceptable for all parties involved. The then President of Mexico, Prime Minister of Canada, and President of the United States, they reached an agreement on the deal on September the 30th of 2018, literally with less than an hour to go before the deadline. So I can definitely feel that right now as I'm racing to get these lecture slides out to you by the time I promised I would, which I think was 1:30. So I think I'm going to be getting right at that point, if not slightly after that point. So I can really relate to that sense of urgency here. And the leaders formally signed the final USMCA agreement on November the 30th of 2018, which was quite literally just one day before AMLO took office. So it's quite possible that if somebody more moderate and somebody more mainstream than AMLO were elected president of Mexico, these negotiations would still be ongoing today. It was really the election of AMLO that triggered a sense of urgency on the part of all 3 parties, or all 3 countries. So what exactly is new about USMCA? How does it differ substantially and in consequential terms from NAFTA? So one of the most controversial facets of negotiations, if not the single most controversial sticking point, was what to do about regulations pertaining to the auto sector, and in particular rules of origin. So under USMCA, rules of origin have been raised substantially, largely at the behest of the United States and at the expense of Mexico. So per USMCA, the regional value content threshold for all automobiles produced within North America has been increased from 62.5% to now 75%. So that means for each car and for each truck produced under NAFTA, 75% of the constituent parts and components have to be produced within the North American trade region. And beyond this, 40 to 45% of content that goes into cars and trucks must now come from plants with at least a $16 per hour minimum wage, which is a provision which is going to hollow out entirely auto parts manufacturing and assembly in Mexico. The typical worker in the Mexican auto sector makes between $3.60 and $3.90 per hour. So we're talking about factories in Mexico having to at least quadruple their wages just to make the minimum, just to meet the minimum threshold. So the result of this is that the bulk of automobile production produced under NAFTA is now going to take place in Canada and the United States. So this is something that really is going to hit Mexico hard, and it's also likely going to increase the cost of American-made cars and likely make American car exports much less competitive vis-a-vis competitors from places like Japan, South Korea, and Germany, which we'll get into a little bit later on. In terms of agriculture, Canada was allowed to keep its controversial supply management system, in which it quite heavily protects the dairy and the egg sectors of agriculture. So farmers and ranchers in Canada are a very powerful constituency who've been able to insist upon and protect this very controversial and this very powerful system. Canada, nevertheless, has agreed to open up 3.6% of its dairy market to the United States. So it's budged somewhat on agriculture from where it used to be, but its losses in this domain have been quite limited. And next we have, as opposed to NAFTA, which had no concrete end date, USMCA has a definitive sunset clause. So unless USMCA is renewed, unless the parties come to terms on a renewal, USMCA will terminate within 16 years of its initiation, which should be somewhere around 2035 or 2036. So per this sunset clause, there's going to be a mandatory period of review initiated at 6 years. And if the parties cannot come to an agreement within the next 10 years, the deal will automatically terminate. So this is a major departure from NAFTA. It was something that was quite heavily lobbied for by the Trump administration in the United States. It's something that a number of analysts fear will hurt and threaten investor confidence, make investors less secure about investing within the USMCA framework. So it's one of the more controversial aspects of the agreement, despite the fact that 16 years is a relatively long period of time. Trump initially had lobbied for 10 years. So this was at least a bit of a reprieve from the timeline that the Trump administration had initially proposed. So moving on to what's new. So USMCA is the first free trade agreement ever to include a chapter on intellectual property rights, Chapter 20. So this extends copyright terms to 70 years after the death of a copyright's author, which is up from 50 years, and penalizes various forms of cyber theft and cyber piracy. So it's part of a number of different terms within USMCA which seek to modernize free trade in a digital age. So we go back to the year 1994. The internet is in its infancy. The digital age is sort of in its earliest throes. There's a lot about how the economy has grown and developed and changed since then that negotiators couldn't have reasonably anticipated back in 1994. So this is one of several ways in which USMCA attempts to grapple with the more digital economy of the 2020s and beyond. There are also a few terms of USMCA which, at the behest and at the urging of the United States, are quite clearly pointed at China. So there are provisions that prohibit currency manipulation. So this has not typically been an issue between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The really big currency manipulator has been China, which for a number of years has used its fixed currency provisions to keep its currency artificially low, to keep its exports to the United States more competitive. So this is not really an issue that's at all entered into the continental trade relationship, but it's nevertheless one that's been written into the USMCA, and one which will likely become a template for subsequent American trade relationships. So that text will quite likely be copied and pasted into new trade deals. And another sort of anti-China initiative here is a provision that allows the United States to withdraw from the agreement altogether on 6 months' notice if either Canada or Mexico signs a trade deal with a quote-unquote non-market economy. So a little bit of sort of pivoting towards China, and this could be understood in the context of the broader trade war between the United States and China that's still ongoing, and an effort on the part of the United States to keep both Mexico and Canada on side. And in terms of labor provisions, which were really lobbied for and really a major priority of the Democrats this go around, and explain why you have more of a buy-in from both parties this time around than you did with the NAFTA agreement in 1994. One of the principal innovations of USMCA is that it creates a so-called rapid response mechanism for workers who work in specific protected facilities to launch complaints and have their complaints heard by a binding panel. This provision places an onus on employers to prove that they're acting in a way that respects workers' rights. So there's a reverse onus of proof on the part of the employer, which creates a very strong regime for the protection of workers' rights. There are also provisions within USMCA that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Quite interestingly, the United States insisted upon inserting a footnote which exempts the United States from those provisions as they pertain to gender identity and the transgendered community. So there are a number of prohibitions in place on the transgendered community in the United States, most prominently within the armed forces. So this can be viewed in that context. Very kind of quizzical and in my view quite an embarrassing move for the United States to make, but nevertheless a provision that was agreed upon by all the parties. So finally, moving on to dispute resolution under USMCA. So we've talked extensively over the past few weeks about dispute resolution mechanisms within NAFTA and their perceived shortcomings. So this was an area of substantial focus among the negotiations leading to the conclusion of USMCA. So quite essentially, we talked a lot about investor-state dispute settlement provisions under Chapter 11 of NAFTA, and particularly some of their more problematic implications in terms of environmental laws and environmental regulations. Well, those have been scrapped altogether in terms of the United States and Canada. So that sort of process of investor petitioning will no longer be in place following a 3-year grace period in which the sort of original terms of NAFTA will be respected through that transition. And in terms of Mexico, investors may only launch disputes, they may only launch complaints in very specific government-controlled sectors dealing with energy, infrastructure, and telecommunication. So they're gone altogether for Canada-U.S. relations. They're substantially pared down in terms of United States-Mexico relations. So finally, in what was a major win for Canada, binational anti-dumping panels. So these are binding panels, again, under Chapter 19 of NAFTA have been preserved. Not only that, but they've been strengthened. As USMCA removes a very problematic loophole which allowed one party, which was usually the United States, to unilaterally block the process by failing to designate a panelist. At this point, there's a provision that where panelists must be designated by a certain point of time, or that case will be forfeited. So that is a major innovation, and it's one that stands to help Canada vis-a-vis the United States. So most grievances under Chapter 19 were launched by Canada and responded to by the United States. The United States no longer has that go-around, so those panels will remain in place, and the United States no longer has the power to unilaterally block the panels. So that was perceived as a really big win for Canada in particular. So overall, who has won and who has lost? Sort of the initial reaction, the kind of hot take, is that the really big winners here are President Trump, who won a resounding bilateral, bipartisan victory with very strong majorities in both the House and the Senate. Major labor unions, in particular the AFL-CIO in the United States, which worked very closely with the United States Trade Representative and got a lot of its favored language in the final agreement. And finally, Canada. So of the three countries, Canada at this point is viewed as the really big winner, and that it didn't have to give up that much on its dairy quotas. So kind of a paltry 3.6%. In exchange for that, it won big by not only keeping the Chapter 19 panels, but strengthening them and removing certain loopholes that allowed the United States up to that point to block the Chapter 19 panels. So Justin Trudeau did pretty good throughout this entire process. The really big loser is going to be Mexico. So we talked about the median Mexican auto worker making $3.50, $3.60 per hour. There's a new provision where 40 to 45% of auto content needs to be produced by workers who are making at least $16 an hour. That will inevitably and invariably lead to a massive migration of Mexican workers, mostly to the United States, but also to Canada. Not the workers themselves, but the jobs. So Mexico is going to be bleeding jobs to its more affluent neighbors who are in a position to be paying those kind of wages to their auto workers and more feasibly. And also prices are going to go up for a number of consumers, especially people who are looking to buy cars that are made in the United States. And the result of the agreement is going to be very hard to predict for the auto sector, and in particular for auto workers. So auto workers in the United States and Canada, they're going to get an immediate bump, but it's unclear how sustainable that bump will be if the changes to the auto sector and the ROOs result in less consumer demand for cars because they're going to be more expensive here in the U.S., and less demand for American auto exports. That might, over a period of 5-10 years, lead to a cooling off of the auto sector as a whole, and some of those jobs falling by the wayside. So it's very difficult to predict from the outset how sensitive some of these jobs are going to be to changes in market conditions, and potentially more expensive American cars built more domestically and abroad. So that's still very much an open question as to one of the consequences of USMCA. So the discussion questions that I will be uploading to Moodle either today or tomorrow are as follows. Does USMCA improve upon NAFTA in a meaningful way? Was this entire exercise worthwhile? And secondly, will USMCA down the road lead to improved continental relations? So look for me to post this question or some variant thereof to the discussion forum. Remember that your discussion posts from this point forward are going to be mandatory. You will have until Sunday evening at 11:59 p.m. to write your first discussion post, and I'll use that post as the basis for both your participation grade and your attendance grade. So keep that in mind. Look for this question to be posted to the forum by tomorrow. So that does it for me. That's all for our lecture on USMCA. I'm going to be having a very exciting discussion on Friday with former Chief of the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development, Aaron Presley. He and I are going to get into some of the specific implications of USMCA for Kentucky. So I'm really excited about that. So that's going to be coming up on Friday. Also keep an eye open for the midterm prep material, which should be coming your way either tomorrow or on Wednesday. So again, I miss y'all. Wish I could be there in person. Please let me know if you have any suggestions as to how I can make the online learning experience more helpful and more effective for y'all. So I think I will leave it at that. I hope you all have a great afternoon and a great evening. Bye.